And I'll be telling you why they were not successful and which ones were successful and why. And so the idea of this is to kind of tell you what I'm looking for when it comes to candle testing. About a week ago, I tested some new jars from Ambrosina Candle Vessel Company, and they were some great looking luxury style jars. There were some matte jars as well as some gloss jars, and you'll see some footage here to kind of refresh your memory on what jars I'm talking about. And in that video, not only was I testing the jars, but I was also talking about the wax and the wicks that I was using. And so I thought I would knock out a few things at once. And so while I was evaluating those jars, I was also wanting to test some wicks as well. So today I'm going to be telling you about how those tests went and let you know the final results of the wicks and the combination and basically how everything turned out. Thank you all as usual for being here. If you are new to the channel, my name is Wade with Black Tie Barn, and on this channel we talk about candle making, candle business, and really anything else that kind of relates. So I hope you guys stick around for future videos. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel below. Give this video a thumbs up and let's get to it. All right, so I'm gonna go in order of the least successful ones up to my favorite or most successful test. And I'll be telling you why they were not successful and which ones were successful and why. And so the idea of this is to kind of tell you what I'm looking for when it comes to candle testing and the kind of things that I'm watching for as far as the wicks go, and of course fragrance throw and everything like that. Now a few of these candles were made with wood wicks and the rest with cotton wicks. And so I will let you know which ones we're dealing with as we get to them. So we're going to start off with the least successful test, which was the orange vessel pumpkin pie. This was the toasted pumpkin spice, I believe. That was the fragrance oil that I used in this. The fragrance was great, by the way, so this wasn't an issue with hot throw or anything like that. This is more specific to the wick testing. Now, the issue with this one is from the very get-go, it was overwicked. So if you remember in the first video where I made these candles, and I will have that linked if you want to check it out, I was talking about how I was going to use some educated guessing to basically test a few different wicks that I thought would be pretty close and see which ones end up being in the right one. Well, I use some jars that are smaller than these, but with the same wax that have some wood wicks in them. Now, wood wicks can be inconsistent time to time, and it will also depend on the fragrance oil you're using. But knowing that in some slightly smaller jars, I was using a 0.02 thickness with a 5/8 inch width, that's the size of the wood wick, I thought, well, this is a larger vessel, I need to go a little bit wider. So let's just, I can either go thicker on the wick or I can go wider on the width of the wick. In this case, I kept the thickness at a 0.02, but I tried to do a 3/4 wick, and honestly, it just ended up being too much. In this case, what I would probably do is keep the 0.02, and then I would go down to probably 5/8 inch. The other option is going to a 0.03 for thickness, and then coming into like a 1/2 inch on the width. For me, when I'm wick testing, I'm less concerned about like what's going on with the melt pool as I am with like what's the overall performance of the wick. Does the wick look appropriate or is it doing anything abnormal? Because if you can get that right, that's going to lead to the byproduct of a good melt pool. Well, in this case, the wick was very hot and sooty and tall, and you could just visibly see that it was too much wick. So why worry about anything else, like the melt pool or hot throw or anything else, if the wick is behaving that way? And so that is why this one was the biggest fail for me as far as the wick that I just decided to test in it, because it just obviously was too large. Now, if you are new to wood wicks and you don't even know what I'm talking about, and I'm just throwing these numbers and you're like, what is he even talking about? Check out my wood wick video all about wood wicks. It goes into detail about how the wick sizing works. Now, the name of some of the wick sizes and the name of the company in that video have changed since then, but the concept is the same. Now, with the sweet tobacco candle, that was in the brown matte jar, I went a different route with that one on the wick. So whereas on the pumpkin one, instead of going more thick, I went wider. Well, on this one, I kept the width the same that I would normally use, and I just went thicker. So I went a 0.03 thickness on this instead of a 0.02. Now, even though the wick wasn't as wide, it still ended up being too much, and that was because I increased the thickness to a 0.03. This wax doesn't really need that thickness normally, but I wanted to try it again with a larger vessel. I thought, let's go ahead and see what would happen. It still ended up being too much. You'll see again in this footage that I was getting a melt pool that was fine, but if you look at how the wick bit was behaving, it really wasn't fine. I don't know that all the footage is going to show all of the burn cycles, but there were times when it was okay. But there were too many times where the wick was too hot, too tall, too kind of jumpy and sooty for me to consider this a pass. So again, in this case, I would probably either come in to maybe a 1/2 inch on the width and keep the 0.03 the same, or I would leave it where it's at on the wick, on the width of a 5/8 of an inch and knock it down to a 0.02. Again, if these numbers don't mean much to you as far as wood wicks go, check out the wood wick video. The rest of these are all cotton wicks. So let's go to the third candle. Now the rest of these I would consider all passes. However, they're going to incrementally get better as we go. And I'm going to start with the lesser of the ones that I would pass. And that was the sea salt and orchid candle that I made in that kind of pink plum translucent jar, that very, very good looking jar. It was a great looking candle. Now, I would still pass this one, but I would make some changes. So I would not settle with this one, even though if I brought this to market, it would work. Again, I would make some changes though to it, and I'm gonna let you know what those changes would be. So with this one, I used 2 HTP 62 wicks, and honestly, they started out perfect, and they looked really, really good for most of the burn. But by the 4-hour mark, which for a jar this size, I think that's kind of what you should be aiming for as a burn cycle or a test cycle. What I'm looking for here is the good overall performance, good profiles on the flame. So I don't want them getting like 2 inches tall. I don't want them throwing smoke and soot. I don't want them leaning too far because they're too heavy. I don't want them mushrooming early on, and I don't want a melt pool that's like an inch deep, right? So those are the kind of things that I'm looking for. And like I said, for most of the burn cycle, that was fine. But on this first burn, around the 4-hour mark, I did get some carbon buildups or mushroom heads on the wicks. Now, a tiny little bit, it's totally fine, and it's really, really normal, and you could trim it off and relight, and you're probably good to go. But if I'm getting it on the first burn, right at the 4-hour mark, to me, it was a little more than I would want. And so even though it's a pass and it performed fine, I would probably go down a size. If I was going to stick with the HTP series, I would probably try 2 HTP 52s, and then hopefully that would be a better size and a better result. If not, then the only other option, because I can't really go in between those two sizes on an HTP, if I continue to have results that I don't really like, then the next option is to move to a different wick type. And we'll get to that in a minute, because in the other 2 candles left, I did use a different wick type. But if you are curious how these 2 HTP 62 wicks turned out, they were good, but I'd still make some changes. They weren't great. So next up was the one in the white matte jar. And this was that clean kind of Cotton Creek fragrance that I used. It's a very kind of classic basic fragrance. It's nothing too unique, but I just love it. It reminds me of like doing laundry. In fact, I have a candle called Laundry Day that uses this fragrance. I've just always been a fan of this scent. But again, this isn't a fragrance review video, so I'll let that just go for now. So in this vessel, I used 2 Eco 1 wicks. I have experience using this wax quite a bit. And if you want a refresher on this, this is a Soy Pour 1280, which is a 50-50 parasoy wax with a melt point of around 125 degrees. You can find the equivalent of this wax called Pro Blend 600 from Flaming Candle, or Joy Wax from Nature's Garden. And it's a low melt point, very easy to burn, soft wax. And so a lot of wick types work in this wax. And for me, it's all about figuring out the one that I think is the best. And sometimes it will be a different wick type based off the jar I'm using. And anyone that's used waxes in various jars, you might know what I mean. Anyways, because I've used this wax a lot, I know that Eco Wicks are usually too hot for this wax. And so I always have to use kind of the smallest size. So even with this one, I started with the 2 smallest Eco Wicks that I have, other than ones made for little tea lights, which were Eco 1. So I used 2 of them. Now in this jar, I didn't really place them very well in the vessel, so they were a little close together, and you'll see that when it's burning a little bit. Not enough to really like change the result of this candle, but it's just, you know, ideally they should be a tad further apart. I'd rather have them closer together than closer to the side walls, but I like them about an inch apart in the middle on this vessel. So how do these burn? Well, first of all, the fragrance thrower was great. The Eco Wick, they are a twisted flat braid cotton wick that have some paper threads run through them, just like an HTP wick or a CD wick. But one thing that Eco is nice about those is they're a little bit more rounded. They have a tad more rigidity to them than the HTP or CD wicks. So the reason I mention that is these 2 wicks did stand up pretty good and stayed center in this jar through most of the burn. And the wick sizing was actually perfect. It was exactly right. It was 2 Eco 1s in this vessel. They did get a tiny bit of a little mushroom on them. Again, this one was actually much better than the previous one with the HTP wicks. If I didn't have the next candle that we're going to talk about, this would have been my best one, and I wouldn't have really had any complaints about it. So all in all, this candle burned very, very well, with the exception of, again, I just put them a little too close together for my taste. Okay, that leaves the last one, which was the red apple, Macintosh apple fragrance that I use in that matte red jar. First of all, this was one of my favorite looking of the candles anyways, although I don't know, I actually liked them all, so I don't really know why I said that. This one by far burned the best. And I used 2 Premier 720 Wicks, absolutely perfectly burning candle. It took a couple hours that first burn to kind of get the melt pool I was looking for, but by the 4-hour mark, it was perfect with no smoke, no soot. The wick is self-trimming perfectly with that size. Now granted, proper wicking comes down to the combination of wax, wick, jar, and fragrance. So the 720 might have been perfect in this combination, but doesn't necessarily mean it's going to burn as well in other fragrances, because fragrances are part of the recipe, part of that combination, and they can alter wicking a little bit. So there are going to be some of these scents or candles that might need one size larger or one size smaller. But all in all, this would be the wick type and size that I would start with as like my base whenever I'm testing new scents with this wax and this size of a jar or vessel. And then I would adjust from there as needed. But you'll see again in this footage, the flame profile was perfect throughout. It left a tiny little hang up, the first couple hours of burning, and then it would always catch up. And it's just perfect profiles on the flames. Never got more than like an inch tall. No soot, no mushrooms, amazing hot throw. No issues whatsoever. And one thing that I really like about the Premier Wicks, sort of like the Eco Wicks, when they're sized properly, they have hardly any afterglow and no smoke. So you could blow out the wick and the smoke's gone within a matter of a second or two. Love that about these wicks. Again, if they're sized properly. So these wicks had a tiny little curl or bend to them as they were burning, and that's sort of that self-trimming effect. Now, if a wick is too large and it does that, not only will it still get a mushroom head on it, but if it bends too much, it can actually curl back into the wax. You don't want that. So you're kind of looking for a slight kind of curl, like a 45-degree bend on it. And that's really it. That's the perfect wick profile and flame profile that you're going for. So this was a winner for me. Not only is it a pass, but this would be like a 10 out of a 10 pass for me. So again, that would be what I use going forward as my baseline of to test everything else against. This is what I'm trying to achieve on all my testers and get as close to as possible. Now I have a more detailed testing process. If I were to choose a vessel and I'm going to throw a few different wick types and I'm going to test a few candles at once and try to figure out the best option, I've got a video that talks about the process that I like to use, or one of the processes I like to use. And so I didn't go into all those details in this, but because this was just a video I did about a week ago where I poured some test candles using several different fragrances and several different wicks, if I was just going to test those, what I would be looking for. And that was the purpose of this video. For me, even though I do like candles that have some wood wicks and I've got a line of them, I personally preferred the double cotton wicks in this jar, this vessel, more than I like the wood wicks. So I would probably be sticking with that. But again, that's kind of preference. I'm going to take a minute real quick and show you how I kind of track these results in my notes and testing that I've done with this. And there are several ways to do this. You can do this with pen and paper. You can do this with your own log or a spreadsheet or some kind of journal or testing templates that you've made. And I do track testing kind of a different way, like as I'm doing it. But then I wanted to show you where I put my final testing notes. And I actually do that in the same software I use for a lot of different purposes when it comes to candle making, which is Crafty Base. A lot of you have been around on my channel forever, so you already know what I'm talking about here. But for those of you that aren't familiar with Crafty Base, I use it for inventory, both raw materials and finished goods. I use it for my order management, manufacturing management, my recipes, expenses, pricing, all those kind of things I use it for. But I also will track testing of my products in Crafty Base as well. That way it's one spot I can go to see which test worked and which ones I decided to archive because they were no good. And that way, if I decide to move forward with a product, I've already got my notes in the same system that I'm going to create the recipe for, and the same system that I'm going to make those candles in. So for me, it makes sense just to put it all there. Thank you all for tuning in. Let me know in the comments section, as we are approaching fall and winter, what some of the new fragrances that you're planning on releasing in any of your collection. And even if you're not running a business, just some new fragrances that you're working on for the holidays that are upcoming. I love learning more about your guys' products. I just love hearing from you all. So let me know in the comments what you're working on. With that being said, thanks for tuning in as always, and hope to see you around in the future. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and I'll see y'all next time.